At exactly 9:47 every single night, Diane Colston lifts a warm porcelain cup from the kitchen counter and carries it to the small oak table where her husband of 31 years is already waiting. Her hands do not shake anymore. They used to, 4 months ago, back when she first understood what was happening inside that cup. Now her fingers are steady, almost calm, the way a person becomes calm only after they have made peace with something most people would call impossible. Richard always smiles when she sets it down in front of him. He always says the same 3 words, "Thank you, dear," in the same practiced tone he has used for 3 decades. And every night, without fail, he drinks every last drop, never once suspecting that the cup in his hand was never meant for him at all. Every night, my husband hands me a cup of tea he believes will make me sicker. Every night, I hand it back to him instead. Those words were not written for a script. They were spoken quietly, almost matter of fact, by a 58-year-old woman sitting in a modest living room in Ohio, describing a routine that had defined her marriage for 4 straight months. She did not say it with anger. She said it the way someone describes a job they have grown used to doing, a task performed so many times it no longer feels dangerous, even though every single detail of it is. It is the kind of sentence that makes you sit up straighter, because it means someone spent 4 months lying beside a man who wanted her gone, and never once let him see it on her face. Picture the moment frozen in place. Richard's head tilted back slightly, the cup pressed to his lips, his eyes half closed with the same contentment he has shown at that table for 31 years. He has no idea that his own plan has turned completely against him. He has no idea that the woman across from him figured out exactly what he was doing, and instead of running, instead of screaming, instead of calling the police the moment she knew, she chose something far more patient and far more dangerous for both of them. That image, his unaware face mid-sip, is where this story truly begins, because everything that follows explains exactly how 2 people who shared a bed, a home, and 3 decades of memories ended up on opposite sides of the same quiet, silent war. By the end of this story, you will understand exactly how a marriage built on control became a countdown, and who was really in danger the entire time. You will learn what Richard Colston stood to gain from his wife's decline, and what Diane discovered hidden in his business records that made her realize she was never simply his wife, she was his exit plan. You will hear how a woman with no money of her own, no family close enough to help, and no proof strong enough for a courtroom, built an entirely secret second life inside her own marriage, 1 cup at a time. And you will find out what finally happened the night the balance between them could no longer hold, and one of them was forced to face exactly what 4 months of silence had built. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because what you are about to hear is not a simple story of a victim and a villain. It is the story of a woman who was underestimated for 31 years by the one person who should have known her best, and the price he never expected to pay for making that mistake. Diane and Richard Colston had been married for 31 years when this story truly begins, living in a quiet 2-story house on the edge of a small Ohio town where everyone believed they knew exactly who the Colstons were. Richard was the man who built a modest hardware business into a small regional chain, the man who shook hands at church socials and sponsored the Little League team every spring. Diane was simply known as his wife, a woman who had once trained as a nurse before giving up that career to support his ambitions. Nobody in that town had any reason to suspect that behind the porch light and the trimmed hedges, one of them had already decided the other needed to disappear, and the other had already decided she would survive it. There are 3 questions that will follow you through every single minute of this story, and none of them have simple answers. Why would a man who spent 3 decades building a respected public image slowly poison the woman who helped him build it? How did Diane discover what was happening to her own body before it was too late? And why, once she knew the truth, did she choose silence over calling the police that very same night? And perhaps the hardest question of all, once she made her decision to switch that cup for the very first time, what did she know was waiting for her on the other side of 4 months? because nothing about what she did was going to end quietly for either one of them. To understand how far this marriage had traveled, you have to go back to where it started, in a small-town diner in the early 1990s, where a 27-year-old Richard Colston first met a 24-year-old nursing student named Diane Whitmore. She was working a double shift at the hospital, 2 blocks away, and had stopped in for coffee before her overnight rotation. He was there with 2 co-workers from the hardware store, where he had just been promoted to assistant manager, already talking, according to people who knew him then, about the day he would own a store of his own, rather than simply run someone else's. By every account from those who were there, it was not a dramatic love story. It was steady, practical, the kind of courtship built on shared ambition rather than sweeping romance. Diane has said that what drew her to Richard in those early days was his certainty. She had grown up in a household where very little felt stable, where her father moved from job to job, and her mother often worked 2 of her own just to keep the lights on. Richard spoke about the future the way other people spoke about the past, with total confidence, already describing the store he would build, the neighborhood he would raise a family in, the kind of life he intended to give someone. For a young woman who had never once heard a plan spoken with that much conviction, it felt less like romance and more like relief, the sense that if she stayed close to him, she would never have to feel that same instability again. Within 18 months, they were married in a small ceremony at Diane's childhood church, and within 3 years, Diane had left her nursing program entirely, at Richard's insistence, to help him run the counter of his very first store. He framed it at the time as a temporary sacrifice, something they would only need for a year or 2 while the business found its footing, and Diane, still in her 20s and eager to prove herself as devoted as the wife she believed she was supposed to be, agreed without much argument. She has since said that giving up her nursing license felt, at the time, like an act of love rather than a loss, and it would take her nearly 3 decades to understand how much that single decision would come to cost her. For the first decade, the sacrifice seemed to pay off exactly the way Richard had promised. His single hardware store became 2 locations within 4 years, then 4 locations spread across 3 counties by the time their oldest child started school, and the Colston name became something people across that region recognized and respected. Richard was invited to speak at the County Chamber of Commerce. He sponsored the local Little League team every spring, coached briefly when their son was young enough to play, and became the kind of local figure that neighbors pointed out to newcomers as an example of what hard work could build in a small town. Diane raised their 2 children largely on her own during those years, since Richard's hours only grew longer as the business expanded. By every outward measure, theirs looked like a marriage that had simply chosen a traditional path and made it work. And for a long time, even Diane believed that was the whole truth of it. She remembers hosting holiday dinners for extended family, decorating the house every autumn the way her own mother never had the money or time to do, and feeling, in brief moments, genuinely proud of the life she and Richard had built together out of almost nothing. Neighbors would later describe the Colstons as one of the steadier couples in town, the kind of marriage other people pointed to when they wanted to believe that stability and hard work were enough to make anything last. But those close to Diane in those middle years describe a quieter pattern forming underneath the surface, one that rarely gets discussed in polite conversation, because it rarely announces itself all at once. Richard began managing every dollar that came into their household almost as soon as the business started generating real profit, insisting that Diane did not need to worry herself with the finances, since he had it entirely under control. At first, this felt like consideration, one less burden on a woman already raising 2 children and running a store counter part-time. It would be years before Diane recognized it, instead, as the first thread in a much larger pattern that would eventually leave her with no financial identity of her own at all. The narrowing continued slowly enough that Diane rarely noticed any single moment as the turning point. Richard began questioning which friendships were worth keeping, gently at first, suggesting that certain women in her circle were a bad influence, or too negative, or simply not the kind of company a Colston wife should keep. He decided which family visits were worth the drive and which were not, often citing the cost of gas or the demands of the business as reasons to decline invitations from Diane's side of the family more often than his own. Diane's mother, in particular, visited less and less over the years, and Diane has admitted since that she rarely questioned it out loud, telling herself each time that Richard's reasoning made sense, that he was simply protective, practical, focused on what mattered most. By the time their 2 children were grown and had moved away for college and careers of their own, the marriage had narrowed into something almost unrecognizable from where it began, nearly 3 decades earlier. Diane no longer had access to a single bank account in her own name, every purchase requiring either cash Richard handed her directly or a card he monitored closely enough to comment on nearly every transaction. Her phone calls were often questioned when she returned home from errands, her outings quietly tracked through receipts and mileage he would casually mention over dinner, all of it framed by Richard as concern, as love, as nothing more than a husband simply looking out for his wife after so many years together. Friends who once visited regularly slowly stopped coming around during this period, uncomfortable with a tension in the house they sensed, but could never quite name or explain to Diane directly. One longtime neighbor has since described noticing that Diane seemed to check with Richard before answering even simple questions about her own schedule, a small habit that struck her as odd at the time, but not alarming enough to mention. Diane herself has said in the years since that she spent a long stretch of her marriage telling herself this was simply what a long partnership looked like after 3 decades together, that every marriage required this kind of quiet compromise, and that questioning any of it felt disloyal to a life she had already given so much of herself to build alongside him. What almost nobody outside that house knew, not even Diane herself until the final 2 years, was that Richard's business, the very foundation of everything he had built his identity and his community standing around, had been quietly failing for nearly 2 years by this point. Rising costs, a series of poor investments in expanding locations that never turned a profit, and increasing competition from larger regional chains had pushed the Colston hardware stores to the edge of collapse. A fact Richard kept hidden even from Diane, let alone from the community that still saw him as a steady local success story worth admiring. He continued attending Chamber of Commerce meetings, continued sponsoring the Little League team, even as the checks grew harder to write, maintaining an image that had become, by then, almost entirely disconnected from the truth of his finances. Behind closed doors, away from the public version of himself he had spent 30 years perfecting, Richard grew short-tempered, distant, and prone to long silences that Diane had learned over the years not to interrupt, no matter how unsettling they became. Dinner conversations grew shorter. Questions about the business were met with clipped answers, or none at all. Diane has said she noticed the change but attributed it, as she had attributed so much else over the years, to the ordinary pressures of running a business in a difficult economy, never once suspecting that the silence sitting across the table from her each night was hiding something far more calculated than simple financial stress. And then, roughly 18 months before this story truly begins, without any real explanation, beyond a passing comment over dinner, Richard quietly increased Diane's life insurance policy to a figure significantly higher than what they had carried for most of their marriage. When Diane asked why, he told her only that it was simply about being responsible, about peace of mind for both of them as they got older, the kind of practical decision a careful husband makes for his family's future. She signed where he indicated, without asking many further questions, the same way she had signed so many other documents over 3 decades of a marriage built on the quiet assumption that Richard always knew best. It would be more than a year before she understood exactly what that single decision had actually been preparing the ground for. It started with something Diane could barely describe to herself at first, a strange metallic taste that lingered at the back of her throat long after she finished her evening tea, faint enough that she assumed for weeks it was simply a side effect of getting older, the kind of small physical change nobody warns you about until it arrives. She began sleeping poorly around the same time, waking at odd hours with a heaviness in her limbs that no amount of rest seemed to resolve, and mornings that left her feeling far more exhausted than any ordinary night's sleep should allow. She mentioned none of it to Richard, and certainly not to anyone outside the house, assuming it was simply her body, changing in ways women her age were told to expect and quietly endure without complaint. What troubled her far more than the physical symptoms themselves, once she allowed herself to notice it, was a subtle shift in the way Richard watched her drink each night. He had never paid particular attention to her tea before, not in 3 decades of marriage, but now he seemed to wait for it, to study her over the rim of his own cup, with an expression she could not immediately name. It was not concern exactly, and it was not affection either. It was something closer to anticipation, the way a person watches a clock when they are waiting for a specific moment to arrive, and once she noticed it, she found she could not stop noticing it every single night after that. Diane began keeping a private notebook, hidden inside an old sewing box tucked at the back of a closet Richard never touched. A habit she started almost without deciding to, simply needing somewhere to put the small observations that had begun accumulating in her mind with no outlet. She wrote down dates, symptoms, and small details of Richard's behavior each evening. How long he watched her drink, how visibly relieved he seemed once she finished the cup entirely, how his own mood would shift afterward into something calmer, almost satisfied, in a way that unsettled her more than his usual silence ever had. She wrote in the smallest handwriting she could manage, terrified even then of what it might mean if he ever found those pages. It took several weeks of careful, quiet observation before Diane allowed herself to consider what her nursing training, unused for nearly 3 decades but never entirely forgotten, had once taught her about certain compounds. She remembered lectures from her 20s about substances that, administered slowly and in small enough amounts, could produce exactly the pattern of symptoms she was now experiencing, without ever raising immediate alarm in the person consuming them. It was a thought she resisted for a long time, turning it over and setting it aside repeatedly, because believing it meant accepting something about the man she had shared a bed with for 31 years that she was not certain she could survive believing all at once. There were nights during this period when Diane would lie awake long after Richard had fallen asleep beside her, running through every possible innocent explanation she could think of, telling herself she was imagining patterns that were not really there, that exhaustion and suspicion were feeding each other in ways that had nothing to do with reality. But each morning brought the same lingering taste, the same heaviness in her body, and each evening brought the same watchful expression on Richard's face across the table, until the innocent explanations she kept offering herself began to feel thinner and less convincing with every single day that passed. The confirmation came through Carol Whitfield, an old friend from Diane's nursing school days, who now worked as a pharmacist 2 towns over, someone Richard had never bothered to monitor closely because he considered her irrelevant to his wife's daily life. Diane arranged to meet her under the pretense of an ordinary lunch, the kind of visit Richard would never think to question, and brought with her a small sample she had carefully saved from one of her cups, along with a list of her symptoms written out in the careful, clinical language her training had never fully left her. She remembers her hands shaking as she slid the small container across the table, terrified of what Carol might say, and equally terrified of what it would mean if she said nothing troubling at all. Carol's response, delivered quietly over untouched coffee at a diner outside of town, confirmed what Diane had feared and denied in equal measure for weeks. The compounds were consistent with a slow, deliberate poisoning, administered in amounts small enough to avoid drawing suspicion from a doctor or an emergency room, but steady enough that continued exposure would eventually become dangerous, then eventually fatal if it continued indefinitely. Carol asked her gently, more than once, whether she wanted to go to the police that same day, whether she had somewhere safe to go if she needed to leave the house immediately. Diane has said she remembers sitting completely still for a long moment, absorbing a truth she had already suspected, but had never allowed herself to fully confirm out loud until that exact moment. Diane has said that in the days immediately following that confirmation, she considered going straight to the police more than once, rehearsing the conversation in her head, during quiet moments throughout the day. But she also understood her own situation with a clarity that only someone who had lived inside it for 3 decades could possibly have. She had no money of her own beyond what Richard allowed her in cash each week. She had no access to any joint account he did not personally control and monitor. And she had only a single sample and a private notebook filled with her own observations, evidence a defense attorney could easily dismiss in front of a jury as the imagination of a bitter, aging wife with no formal proof to support her claims. She had also watched Richard charm police officers, town officials, and business partners for 30 years, present himself as reasonable and generous and community-minded in front of anyone whose opinion mattered, and she understood exactly how easily he could turn any accusation from her back around into a story about her own instability instead. So instead of confrontation, instead of the dramatic exit she sometimes imagined late at night, Diane made a decision that surprised even her when she first allowed herself to consider it fully, one that would require more patience and more careful deception than anything she had ever attempted in her entire life. She spent several days after that conversation with Carol simply thinking, turning the idea over in her mind, while continuing to drink the tea Richard placed in front of her each night, terrified that even the smallest change in her behavior might alert him to what she now knew. She has described this stretch of time as the loneliest of her entire marriage, sitting across from a man she had loved for 3 decades, while carrying knowledge she could share with almost no one, forced to smile at the same dinner table conversations, while privately calculating exactly how much longer her body could withstand what he was doing to it before she needed to act. The first switch happened on a Tuesday evening, 4 months before the moment this story first opened, and Diane has described the feeling as almost unbearable in the seconds before she attempted it. Richard had stepped briefly into the next room to answer a phone call from one of his store managers, giving her perhaps 90 seconds alone in the kitchen, with both cups sitting side by side on the counter, exactly as she had positioned them every night for weeks while working up the nerve. Her heart pounded so loudly in her own ears that she worried he might somehow hear it from the other room, her hands moving quickly but carefully as she exchanged the 2 cups, uncertain whether he would notice any difference in weight, temperature, or placement when he returned. He did not notice. Richard walked back into the kitchen, still talking on the phone, sat down at the table without a second glance at the cup in front of him, and finished the call before lifting the tea to his lips and drinking it without any hesitation at all, the same practiced calm on his face he wore every single night. In that moment, watching him swallow what had been intended for her, Diane has said she felt something close to disbelief, followed almost immediately by a wave of fear so intense she had to excuse herself briefly to the bathroom, simply to steady her own breathing, before returning to finish the evening, as though nothing at all had happened. She did not sleep that night, lying awake beside him and listening to his breathing, half expecting some visible reaction, some sign that he had somehow noticed after all, that the entire evening had been some sort of test she had failed without realizing it. But morning came, and Richard rose exactly as he always did, showing no unusual symptoms beyond his ordinary complaints about stress and fatigue that had already become familiar over recent months. It was only then, watching him move through his normal routine with no apparent awareness of what had happened the night before, that Diane understood she had just crossed a line there was no walking back from, and that whatever came next, her life had already changed permanently the moment she made that first exchange. From that night forward, every single evening became a quiet, deliberate act of survival, repeated with a precision that Diane herself has said still surprises her when she looks back on it now. She developed small rituals to disguise the switch, timing it to moments when Richard was reliably distracted, adjusting her own routine slightly each week to avoid falling into a pattern he might eventually notice, all while maintaining the same outward behavior she had shown him for 3 decades of marriage. She learned to watch his reactions with the same careful attention he had once turned on her, studying his energy levels, his mood, his small complaints about feeling unwell, cataloguing each change in her hidden notebook, as both evidence and, increasingly, as a kind of grim confirmation that the danger she had escaped was now landing squarely on someone else. By the time 4 months had passed, and this story first opened on that ordinary Tuesday evening at 9:47, Diane had carried out the switch 120 separate times, each one requiring the same careful timing and the same composed expression she had perfected through sheer necessity. She has said that, somewhere around the 2nd month, the fear of being caught began to feel almost familiar, a low hum beneath every evening, rather than the overwhelming terror of that very first night. What never faded, she has admitted, was the quiet awareness that she was no longer simply a victim waiting to be rescued, but a woman who had made an active, ongoing choice every single night to let events unfold exactly as they were unfolding, fully aware of where that choice might eventually lead them both. While Richard continued his nightly ritual completely unaware of what it had become, Diane began building a second, entirely secret life inside the same house she had lived in for nearly 3 decades. It started small, almost accidentally, the first time she noticed a folder of unpaid invoices left open on Richard's desk while he showered one evening. She had walked past it 100 times before without a second thought, but now, with everything she knew sitting quietly beneath the surface of her own composure, she found herself pausing, reading a few lines, memorizing a figure, before continuing down the hallway as though nothing had changed. That single moment became the first thread in what would grow into months of careful, patient information gathering, conducted in the small gaps of time Richard left unguarded. Over the following weeks, Diane learned to move through the house differently, noticing which drawers were left unlocked, which evenings Richard fell asleep in his study rather than making his way upstairs, which business calls he took with his office door left carelessly ajar. She began collecting copies of financial documents whenever the opportunity presented itself, photographing pages on an old phone Richard had long since forgotten she still owned, slowly piecing together the true extent of a business collapse far more severe than anything she had previously imagined. Debts stretched across 3 different lenders. Payments on 2 of the 4 store locations were months behind. And buried within a folder of insurance correspondence, she found the policy Richard had increased 18 months earlier, its terms now making a different, colder kind of sense than the peace of mind he had once claimed it represented. Diane reached out quietly to a divorce attorney 2 counties away, a man named Grant Hensley, whose name she had found listed in an old newspaper clipping about a legal aid seminar, someone with no connection to anyone in Richard's circle of business associates or social contacts. She used a friend's name to schedule the very first consultation, terrified of what would happen if Richard discovered even the smallest hint of her planning before she was ready to act on any of it. That first meeting with Grant took place in a small office above a dry cleaner, and Diane has said she spent much of the hour simply trying to keep her voice steady as she explained, in careful and measured language, exactly what she believed was happening inside her own home. Grant listened without interrupting, taking notes on a legal pad, and when she finished, he told her plainly that what she had described went far beyond the scope of an ordinary divorce case, that she needed to think not only about ending the marriage, but about documenting everything in a way that could protect her legally if the situation ever became public. He advised her to continue gathering evidence quietly rather than confronting Richard prematurely, warning her that an early confrontation without sufficient documentation could leave her in a far more vulnerable position than the one she was currently in. Diane left that meeting with a strange mixture of fear and relief, finally having spoken the truth aloud to someone with the power to help her, even as the weight of everything ahead of her settled more heavily than before. At the same time, Diane was building this quiet case against her husband. Richard's own health began a decline that confused nearly everyone around him, including Richard himself. Store managers noticed his growing fatigue during morning meetings, his shortened temper over small mistakes that would never have bothered him before, and a kind of mental fog that seemed to worsen gradually by the week. Symptoms he privately attributed entirely to the mounting stress of his failing business, rather than to anything happening inside his own kitchen each night. He began forgetting details of conversations from just days earlier, misplacing paperwork, and losing his composure in meetings in ways that long-time employees described as completely out of character for a man who had built his entire reputation on steady, controlled leadership. The dramatic irony of the situation was not lost on Diane, who watched her husband grow visibly weaker from the very plan he had designed for her, all while she maintained the same calm, dutiful expression she had worn throughout their entire marriage. She has said there were evenings during this stretch when Richard would comment on his own declining health at the dinner table, wondering aloud whether he needed to see a doctor, and she would nod sympathetically, offer to make him a cup of tea to help him relax, and carry out the same switch she had performed for weeks by that point, all while feeling something she still struggles to fully name even now, somewhere between grim vindication and a grief she had not expected to feel, for a man actively trying to end her life. A complication arose during this period in the form of Tom Bradshaw, Richard's longtime business partner, and the man who had co-signed on 2 of the 4 store locations nearly a decade earlier. As the company's financial troubles became harder to hide from employees and lenders alike, Richard grew increasingly resentful of Bradshaw, convinced in private conversations with associates that Bradshaw's poor decisions on inventory and staffing were the true cause of the collapse, rather than his own years of overextension and denial. Richard began quietly excluding Bradshaw from certain financial discussions, redirecting blame in conversations around town, and by the 3rd month of this period, several of Richard's closest associates had come to believe that Bradshaw might be actively working against the business from within. For a period of several weeks, this suspicion pulled attention, including briefly Diane's own attention, away from the truth sitting far closer to home than anyone suspected. Diane initially wondered, while reviewing the financial documents she had gathered, whether Bradshaw's business decisions might somehow be connected to Richard's declining health and mood, entertaining the idea that stress from a betrayal by his own partner might explain some of what she was witnessing. It would take an uncomfortable conversation with Carol, who reminded her plainly that toxicology did not care about business partnerships, to bring Diane's focus firmly back to the evidence she already had in front of her, evidence that had nothing whatsoever to do with Tom Bradshaw, and everything to do with the cup sitting on her own kitchen counter each night. The closest Diane came to being discovered during this entire period happened on an ordinary Thursday evening in the 3rd month, when Richard entered the kitchen earlier than she expected, while she was still mid-switch, both cups sitting exposed side by side on the counter in front of her. She has described the sensation of her entire body going cold in that instant, every carefully rehearsed explanation vanishing from her mind at once, replaced by pure, unthinking instinct. She reached for a dish towel, knocked one of the cups slightly, and told him without missing a beat that she had simply spilled a portion of her tea and was preparing a fresh cup to replace it, a lie delivered so evenly and so quickly that Richard barely glanced up before returning to the mail he was sorting through at the table. It was in that instant, she has said, that she understood exactly how thin the line had become between the woman she used to be and the woman this marriage and this plan had forced her to become. Diane had never in her life considered herself a person capable of lying smoothly under pressure, yet here she was, doing exactly that, with a steadiness that frightened her more than the danger itself. She has spoken since about sitting on the edge of the bathtub for several minutes after that close call, hands pressed against her own face, trying to steady her breathing before rejoining Richard downstairs, as though the entire moment had never happened at all. Diane's internal conflict deepened considerably as the weeks continued to pass, not from guilt over what was slowly happening to Richard's health, but from something far more complicated to sit with. She has spoken about a quiet grief for the version of her marriage she had once genuinely believed in, for the young couple who had married in a small church with real hope for the life ahead of them, a version of Richard she still occasionally glimpsed in small, unguarded moments even now. Alongside that grief sat a growing fear about what she was allowing herself to become in order to survive, a woman capable of watching someone suffer without intervening, night after night, for the sake of her own continued safety. It was Carol, during one of their increasingly frequent quiet meetings at the diner outside of town, who offered Diane the perspective that seemed to settle something in her, at least temporarily. Carol reminded her plainly that documenting Richard's crimes and protecting her own life were not the same thing as becoming him, that there was a meaningful difference between actively causing harm and refusing to continue absorbing harm that had already been set in motion by someone else entirely. Diane has said she clung to that distinction through the hardest weeks that followed, repeating it to herself some nights like a kind of quiet argument she needed to keep winning against her own doubts. By the third month, Richard's paranoia had grown sharp enough that he began telling colleagues, and even a few extended family members, that he believed someone close to him was actively working against him, convinced that the slow unraveling of both his health and his business were connected, orchestrated deliberately by someone determined to see him fail completely. He suspected Bradshaw most openly, occasionally hinting at disloyal employees within his own stores, and once, during a particularly tense phone call Diane happened to overhear, he even speculated darkly about a rival business owner, 2 towns over, who had recently opened a competing hardware store. He never once suspected the quiet woman across the dinner table, who had spent 3 decades learning exactly how to remain invisible inside her own home, the one person with more reason and more opportunity than anyone else he named. As the 4th month approached, Diane had assembled nearly everything Grant Hensley had advised her to gather: financial records spanning nearly 2 years, copies of the insurance correspondence, her own detailed notebook, and a written statement from Carol regarding the sample she had tested months earlier. She began to feel, for the first time since this ordeal began, something resembling a plan rather than simply a means of survival, a sense that the evidence she had collected might soon be enough to protect her, regardless of what happened next. What she could not yet know was exactly how close Richard's own unraveling had already brought them both to a breaking point neither of them had fully anticipated, one that would arrive far sooner than her careful timeline had prepared her for. Richard was right, in the end, that someone was watching every move he made throughout those months, tracking his patterns, documenting his decline, building a case with the patience of someone who understood there would be no second chances if it failed. He was simply completely wrong about who that person was, and wrong about how much longer he had before the truth he had spent so long hiding finally caught up with him from the one direction he had never thought to guard against. The full scope of Richard's original plan came into focus for Diane only after a single evening in the 4th month, when he left his study unlocked for longer than usual, called away suddenly by a phone call from one of his lenders that carried on far past dinner. Diane has said she almost let the opportunity pass, exhausted from months of careful observation and increasingly wary of pushing her luck any further than necessary. But something told her this particular folder, the one she had noticed him reviewing several nights earlier, with unusual intensity, might contain more than the routine paperwork she had already documented, and she decided the risk was worth taking one more time. Inside that folder, she found a set of documents that reframed everything she had pieced together up to that point. Correspondence with an insurance representative laid out, in precise and clinical language, the exact terms of her policy and the specific conditions under which a claim would be processed without extended investigation, provided her death appeared to result from natural causes or a gradual medical decline rather than anything sudden or violent. Alongside those documents sat a separate folder detailing offers Richard had quietly solicited on 2 of the 4 store properties, arrangements that would only make financial sense if he intended to liquidate the business entirely and relocate somewhere far from the town that had known him for 30 years. It became devastatingly clear to Diane in that moment, standing alone in his study, with the desk lamp casting long shadows across the papers in her hands, that Richard had not simply wanted her gone, out of years of accumulated resentment, or the slow erosion of affection that sometimes ends long marriages. He needed her death to look ordinary, unremarkable, easily explained by age or illness, precisely so that he could collect on that policy and quietly disappear before his failing business and mounting debts caught up with him entirely. She was never simply his wife in his eyes during those final months. She had become, in the coldest possible sense, a solution to a financial problem he had created and could no longer manage any other way. This discovery brought with it a danger Diane had not fully considered until she brought the documents to Carol during their next meeting, laying them across the diner table between them, with hands that would not quite stop trembling. Carol read through them slowly, her expression growing more serious with each page, before laying out a possibility that Diane herself had been too consumed by her own survival to fully consider. If Richard were to die from the very substance he had been unknowingly administering to himself for 4 months, an autopsy would almost certainly reveal traces consistent with poisoning. And given that Diane was his wife, given the documented history of financial control and dependency that any investigator would eventually uncover, she could easily become the primary suspect, rather than being recognized as the intended victim she actually was. What had begun 4 months earlier as an act of quiet self-preservation had, without Diane ever fully intending it, evolved into a situation where continuing the switch any further risked ending not with her survival, but with her arrest for a crime that had originated entirely with the man across her own dinner table. Carol asked her directly, that afternoon, how much longer she believed Richard could continue in his current state before his body simply could not sustain any further exposure, and Diane, drawing on nursing knowledge she had not actively used in decades, admitted quietly that she did not know, and that the uncertainty itself had become almost unbearable to carry alone. The emotional weight of everything Diane now understood came to a head one evening roughly a week later, when Richard, visibly weakened and more confused than Diane had ever witnessed him in 3 decades of marriage, reached across the table and took her hand in his grip noticeably less steady than it used to be. He told her, in a voice stripped of all its usual practiced control, that he loved her, that he did not understand what was happening to his own body, and that for the first time in longer than she could remember, he sounded genuinely frightened rather than simply irritated or distant. Diane has said this was, without question, the single hardest moment of the entire 4 months, sitting across from a man who had spent months planning her death, yet hearing something in his voice in that instant that sounded, however briefly, painfully and undeniably human. She sat with his hand in hers for a long moment that evening, saying nothing, her mind moving rapidly between everything she now knew and the decades of shared history that had somehow led both of them to this exact point, at this exact table. She has described it since as the moment she finally understood, with total clarity, that she could not allow this situation to continue any further in silence, regardless of what he had done or intended to do to her, because continuing meant risking an outcome that could end with either his death or her own imprisonment, and neither result would deliver anything resembling the safety or justice she had spent 4 careful months quietly working toward. Carol urged her that same week, more firmly than she had in any previous conversation, to go to the police immediately, before Richard's condition worsened beyond any possibility of a clean and clear medical picture, and before the entire situation could unravel into something neither of them could control or explain afterward. Grant Hensley, when Diane called him the following day, advised precisely the same course of action, warning her in direct terms that continuing to wait only increased her own legal exposure the longer any of this went unreported to the proper authorities, regardless of how sympathetic her original circumstances might eventually appear to anyone reviewing the case. Diane has said that this was the exact point where she finally accepted that patience alone, the very quality that had protected her successfully for 4 full months, could no longer serve as her only strategy moving forward. She understood now that she needed a plan that placed the full truth on record, clearly and permanently, before anyone else, whether Richard himself, a hospital investigator, or eventually the police, had the opportunity to shape the story in a direction that left her exposed. That week became one of the most carefully calculated periods of her entire ordeal, as she worked alongside Grant and Carol to determine exactly how and when to finally bring everything into the open, in a way that would protect her from every possible angle, rather than simply ending the danger she had lived inside for 4 difficult months. Rather than allowing Richard to continue toward a collapse she could no longer predict or control, Diane made a decision that surprised even Carol and Grant Hensley when she first described it to them over the phone late one night. She would confront Richard directly, in their own home, but only after every piece of evidence she had gathered over 4 months, the notebook filled with dates and observations, the photographed financial documents, Carol's written findings from the samples she had tested, and copies of the insurance correspondence, had already been placed securely with Grant and a second trusted party outside the household entirely. She wanted no version of this story to exist, where the only account of what happened depended on what was left inside that house once the confrontation was over. Grant spent the better part of a week helping her prepare, walking her through exactly what to say, and, just as importantly, what not to say, cautioning her against any language that could later be twisted into an admission of intent to harm Richard, rather than a simple statement of the facts as she had lived them. Carol, meanwhile, made sure Diane understood the physical signs to watch for if Richard's condition began to worsen rapidly during or after the conversation, and made her promise, more than once, that she would call for medical help immediately, regardless of what he had done to her. A promise Diane gave without hesitation, despite everything she now knew about him. The confrontation itself took place on an ordinary Tuesday evening, at the same kitchen table where 4 months of quiet cups had already been exchanged 120 separate times without Richard ever noticing. Diane has said she did not raise her voice, did not accuse him with the anger she had every right to feel, but simply laid out what she knew, calmly and methodically, the same measured tone she had once been trained to use decades earlier when delivering difficult diagnoses during her brief nursing career. She began with the taste in her tea, moved through Carol's findings, the notebook, the insurance policy, and finally the documents she had found in his study describing the sale of 2 store properties, watching his face change with every sentence she spoke. Richard's reaction was immediate and entirely physical, a combination of shock at being discovered, confusion that seemed to blur with the visible effects of 4 months of accumulated exposure, and something that looked, for just a moment, like genuine grief at hearing his own plan described back to him in his wife's steady voice. He tried at first to deny it outright, then to minimize it, then finally to justify it in fragmented sentences about the business, about the debts, about feeling as though he had no other way out that would not destroy everything he had spent 30 years building in that town. Diane listened to all of it without interrupting, and within the hour, the strain of the conversation combined with everything already happening inside his body proved too much, and he collapsed at the very table where this entire story had unfolded. Diane, despite every reason she might have had to hesitate in that moment, made the call that sent an ambulance racing to their home without a second of delay. She has said since that there was never any real question in her mind about making that call, that whatever Richard had done to her, and whatever she had allowed to happen to him in response, she was not willing to let him die on the floor of the kitchen they had shared for 3 decades, while she stood by and did nothing to help him. It was, she has said, the final proof to herself that everything she had done over those 4 months had been about survival rather than revenge, a distinction that would matter enormously in the difficult weeks that followed. Richard's hospitalization brought with it exactly the kind of medical scrutiny Carol had warned Diane about months earlier, toxicology results that raised immediate and unavoidable questions law enforcement could no longer dismiss as ordinary illness or coincidence. Detectives arrived at the hospital within days, and later at the house itself, and Diane understood that the moment she had spent 4 months preparing for had finally arrived, with far higher stakes than she had ever faced in her entire life. But because she had already placed her documentation with Grant weeks in advance, the investigation that followed told a very different story than the one Richard might have tried to shape, had he recovered quickly enough to regain control of the narrative before anyone else could examine the evidence closely. Business records, subpoenaed within the first 2 weeks of the investigation, confirmed the financial desperation Diane had already documented on her own, showing debts across 3 lenders and a business that had been effectively insolvent for nearly 2 years. The insurance correspondence confirmed motive in language detectives described as unusually direct for a case built otherwise on circumstantial evidence. And Diane's careful, dated notebook, corroborated in full by Carol's professional testimony regarding the original sample and its timeline, confirmed beyond reasonable dispute that the poisoning had originated with Richard, beginning months before Diane ever made her first switch of the 2 cups on that Tuesday evening in the kitchen. Grant Hensley represented Diane throughout the weeks of questioning that followed, and though investigators initially treated her with the caution reserved for any spouse connected to a poisoning case, the sheer weight and consistency of her documentation, gathered patiently over 4 full months at enormous personal risk, made clear to every investigator who reviewed it that she had been the intended victim from the very beginning, not the perpetrator law enforcement might otherwise have assumed. Diane has said that the day the lead detective finally told her she would not be facing any charges was the first moment in nearly half a year that she felt able to breathe without carefully measuring every word and gesture around her. In the end, it was not revenge that exposed Richard Colston, and it was not deliberate murder either, because Diane had never once intended for him to die, only to survive long enough to build her way safely out of a marriage that had become a countdown toward her own destruction. It was Richard's own paranoia, his own suspicion of the people around him, combined with the medical evidence his failing body could no longer hide from the doctors treating him, that ultimately brought the entire truth into the light of a courtroom, rather than leaving it buried inside a quiet Ohio kitchen. Richard faced prosecution for what he had done, his once respected name in that small town permanently and irreversibly altered by a case that made front-page news across the region for weeks. Diane, after 3 decades of quiet control exercised over nearly every part of her life, walked away for the first time in her adult existence, with her name, her freedom, and a future that finally, completely belonged to her alone. Looking back on those 4 months now, Diane has said the hardest lesson was not about her husband at all, but about herself, about how long a person can convince themselves that endurance is the same thing as safety, and how much courage it actually takes to recognize the exact moment when simply surviving is no longer enough. Her story raises a question that lingers long after the details fade, about trust, about control, and about how well any of us truly know the people we share a table with every single night. If you drank from the same cup, prepared by the same hands, for 31 years, would you notice the exact moment everything quietly changed? Before you go, sit with this story for just a moment longer, because there is something about Diane Colston's 4 months of silence that deserves more than a passing thought once the video ends. This was not a woman who acted out of anger, and it was not a woman who acted out of a desire for revenge either. It was a woman who understood, with a clarity most of us hope we never have to develop, that the person closest to her had already made his decision, and that her only real choice left was how she would respond to a threat no one else around her could see. That kind of quiet calculation, sustained night after night for 4 full months, is a form of strength that rarely gets discussed, because it does not look like strength from the outside. It looks like silence, like patience, like a woman simply pouring tea. What would you have done in Diane's position? Would you have gone straight to the police the moment you first suspected the truth, even knowing you had no proof strong enough to convince anyone, and no financial independence to fall back on if you were wrong? Or would you have done exactly what she did, choosing patience and documentation over confrontation, protecting yourself first, and trusting that the truth would eventually hold up once it finally came out? There is no simple right answer here, and that is exactly why this story has stayed with so many people who have heard it. Tell us in the comments below exactly what you would have done in her place, and be honest, because stories like this one deserve a real conversation, not just a quiet ending once the screen goes dark. We also want to hear whether you saw any part of this coming. Did you suspect early on that Richard was the one in danger, rather than Diane? Or did the reversal catch you off guard, the same way it caught almost everyone in that small Ohio town off guard, once the truth became public? Let us know which moment in the story surprised you the most, whether it was the first switch of the cups, the discovery of the insurance documents, or the moment Richard finally reached for her hand across that same kitchen table. Your comments help us understand exactly which parts of these stories resonate the most, and we read every single one of them. If this story kept you on edge from the very first frozen frame of Richard's face, mid-sip, all the way through to the final verdict, then you are exactly the kind of viewer who is going to want to stay close for what comes next. Our next story takes us to a small coastal town where a husband vanished without a trace one ordinary Sunday morning, leaving behind nothing but an unlocked boat, an untouched breakfast, and a life insurance policy that had quietly changed hands only weeks before he disappeared. What his wife knew, and how long she waited before she told anyone the truth, is a story that very few people expected, and one that we think you are going to want to hear from beginning to end. Before that story arrives, make sure you are subscribed so you never miss it the moment it goes live, along with every other real-life story of betrayal, patience, and the ordinary people who find themselves pushed further than anyone could ever have imagined. Turn on notifications if you want to be among the first to know when the next video is ready, and if you have not already done so, take a moment right now to like this video and share it with someone you think would appreciate a story exactly like this one. These stories only reach the people who need to hear them because of viewers like you, taking a few extra seconds to pass them along. Thank you for spending this time with Diane's story today and for staying with us all the way to the very end. Stories like hers remind us that the people we trust the most are not always who we believe them to be, and that quiet strength often looks nothing at all like what we expect strength to look like from the outside. We will see you in the very next story, and until then, take care of yourselves, and take a closer look at the people sitting across the table from you tonight.